Just want to first begin by saying that I am in no way an expert with respect to history, nor am I somebody who can claim to be an amateur historian. I'm simply just interested in the subject, and I find a lot of passion in reading about it, studying it, obtaining its lessons, because ultimately that is fundamentally the importance of history, is to learn the lessons from the past. And the saying history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, is fairly accurate and can be broadly applied to our world, society, culture today. Additionally, I'm in no way a professional when it comes to this sort of platform. What I mean by that is this type of communication via social media. I'm, again, an amateur in that regard. Yet, that amateurism, which was spawned initially from the reviews that I have done on these books, has ignited a small fire that has slowly but surely continued to burn in the form of my passion and willingness to talk to whomever will listen about not only the books themselves, but the general themes, events, and broad topics that the books touch on. And if you're watching this and you're a little confused maybe as to what I mean when I say books, the reviews that are done are conducted on Instagram and TikTok. And actually, the reason why I'm going about and communicating in this medium was to extrapolate upon and go in depth with respect to the books and to use them as a vehicle, a lens, if you will, to peer into the historical topic that is ultimately discussed within and is the overall theme of the books, or as a general overarching topic that each relate to in their own way. And the idea is new, at least in my mind. I wouldn't be surprised if there are other channels or creative artists out there who are doing this. But it was certainly a new idea that came to me, and it came through a very close friend of mine who was extremely intelligent, sharp, but a kind and caring individual, tremendous all around. And he saw the potential that existed with respect to what was being done on the reviews, and those are only 3 minutes. Some may be more, but ideally around 3 minutes is what you want to shoot for, at least from what I've learned. And he saw that there was a way to go more in depth and really use, and I think I'm going to butcher this term here, so just bear with me, a fine tooth comb to use and go through and get a little bit more substance to the books other than just here's the title, here's who the author is, and this is generally what it's about. Because while it's required in a setting such as Instagram or TikTok, it does not do a service to the author, to the content therein. And in the case of history or historically based books, it doesn't do a service to those who it's being discussed or talked about, good, bad, or indifferent. It is certainly important not to minimize those stories and in any way to make it appear as though they are not valuable, because they certainly are. And that's what my friend saw in this. Hence, why I've decided to trust in his counsel, certainly his friendship, take his advice, and go about doing this series, these episodes. I don't really know what to call it at this point. But for now, we'll just stick with this episode because it could very well be the only one. I'm really hoping that's not the case, but who knows? Additionally, and these are all, by the way, prerequisites before we get into the meat and potatoes, as they say, of this episode. But I figured I'd give a few disclaimers or just some background administrative points so as to make it clear where things stand from my perspective. So that way it makes sense as we go forward. Additionally, this idea was also inspired in large part by Dan Carlin, who, for those who don't know, is a podcaster. He doesn't call himself a historian, but I certainly would because he brings it to life. And he actually wrote a book, so he certainly does fall into that category. It's a tremendous book, what he wrote. And he is able to take historical topics, whether it's the rise of the Persians or Caesar and Gaul, capital punishment, nuclear war, you name it, he is able to take the subject and he's able to look at it from a myriad of different perspectives. He doesn't hold back at all from any of the grim, gruesome, ugly details that surround the topics he discusses. And frankly, that's what makes it so great because history often is not kind, it is not pleasant, and it is certainly not PG. It's just the opposite. And the more you actually look at history and the more that you're able to view it, the more gruesome it becomes. And this is especially true with how Kylan presents it. He's able to really bring that out, that ferocity, that brutality, that gruesome element to it. And he's able to do so in a way whereby his episodes on the topic tend to run for quite a while. And that's no knock against what he does. I think that those are certainly preferred over 25, 30-minute quick videos. And they really get into the nitty-gritty details as a result. But I have to caution myself because I am certainly not on his level now, or who knows if I will ever be. I would like to think so. But for right now, we'll just stay small and say that I'm certainly nowhere in his orbit. Thereby, I'm not going to try and replicate his volition, his durations when it comes to his videos. The style you will see is very similar, and there will be some correlations between how he does his podcast and how this is going to be conducted. I'm not trying to copy him in any way, but it certainly makes a lot of logic and sense to try and use somebody as a model who knows what they're doing, who has been successful, and to try and emulate them. Certainly not one for one, as I said, but in a way where you can possibly be as successful. So that means I won't be 4.5, 5 hours like some of his episodes are, but they will certainly not be 3 to 5 minutes, which, as I have said, is the general ideal time for Instagram and TikTok videos. And if you've gotten or stayed this far in the video, that's already been eclipsed twofold. It's already twice as long. So look at it, if you could imagine, on a spectrum between that 3 to 5 minutes and between 4 hours. I know that's sort of a big spectrum, but that's what is going to be the goal, and that's what my hope is to shoot for. I'd like to keep it on the efficient and crisp side, but by the same token, I certainly don't want to discount what it is that was read and not go into depth regarding the content therein. So it's going to be a balancing act on my end, and I hope that you'll not only forgive me, but you will initially cut me some slack. And whether or not I deserve it, I think that'll ultimately be up to the discretion of the viewer. But what I will say is that I will do my best on my end to try and make this as efficient, effective, and enjoyable as possible. At the end of the day, we're all here to have a good time. I could go on for hours and hours about this subject, but I know anyone else listening has a life. So, bearing that in mind, I'm not going to be overwhelming and suffocating with the duration of these videos. And then, last but certainly not least, is the fact that in these past 12 to 13 minutes, you've probably noticed in how I talk that there is an accent, and it is, for better or worse, pretty strong, pretty thick. And given some of the books that I've reviewed and will review, and will thereby discuss here on this channel, it could get a little dicey when it comes to trying to pronounce words, not only in English, that's going to be an obstacle in and of itself, but other languages: French, Italian, Dutch, German, Russian, Japanese. The list is practically endless. As many languages that exist right now in the world, or existed whenever the book that will be discussed existed, it is, I think, almost a certainty that how they were intended to be pronounced will not be properly pronounced by me. And I admit that. I fully admit that. And if it's burdensome to your ears as the listener, well, I apologize. I will do my best, but I will offer no guarantees as to whether or not this dialectic and accented problem will be remedied. I would like to think that as this progresses, I can maybe obtain a little bit more of an understanding of how to pronounce words in certain cultures and languages, especially if they happen to be in a series of books that are read chronologically and consecutively. But again, I offer no guarantees. The only guarantee I offer is an apology here and now that if it's brutal, if it's burdensome, know that you've been advised, and I hope that it isn't a deterrent in any way for listening. So, with that all being said, it is now prudent to take the first step and begin this episode, which covers Operation Market Garden. As the description notes, this was a high risk, high reward gamble that the Western Allies had hoped would work and thus ending the war by Christmas 1944. Just to provide some context as to how it is that the Allies had gotten to this place and how they were able to calculate and or speculate that they could indeed end the war by Christmas, let's just take a step back to the summer of 1944. I don't want to necessarily get into the weeds of going all the way back because that would dilute, I think, the importance of the episode and the books, but certainly a broad brushstroke and a sample of the context that has gotten us to where this episode will be discussing is certainly necessary. So in June of 1944, June 6th that is, the Western Allies landed on continental Europe, or I should say France, because in 1943, the Allies had landed in Italy, Sicily first and then Italy. But everyone that considers the invasion of continental Europe begins or has the start date on June 6, 1944. And that was Operation Overlord. And that was, at the time, and possibly still holds this record, the largest invasion with amphibious and airborne forces in military history. There were 5 beaches and a series of cliffs that were separating the American beaches. There were 3 airborne divisions, scores of fighter and bomber support, naval ships offshore providing fire support, logistics, transportation, medical assistance. And it all came together in a crucible in World War II. It's often considered the turning point for World War II. I myself wouldn't necessarily go that far because by this point in time, it was already very obvious to any objective observer or bystander that the Axis were pretty much on the ropes. In Europe, they were holding their own against the Allies in Italy, but obviously, slowly but surely, that war of attrition grounded both sides down, as attrition does not have a favorite. In the East, the Germans were reeling after a series of defeats in the winter and then early spring 1944, one of those being the liberation of Leningrad. Though the Germans never took the city, they besieged it for around 900 days, which is an incredible feat in and of itself to the citizens of Leningrad. And by the way, Leningrad today is St. Petersburg. At one point, it was called Petrograd. It was the capital of the Tsarist Russian Empire. But it speaks to the credit of the civilians in Leningrad that they were able to withstand that siege. So the Germans were on the ropes in the east. In the Far East, the Japanese were slowly being pushed back, and their ring of island defenses within the larger Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was being whittled away. They had lost on Guadalcanal and at Midway, both in 1942. 1943 saw the defeat in New Guinea and the loss of the islands of Tarawa and Macon. And then in the spring of 1944, the Allies were able to push deeper into New Guinea, as well as capturing the islands of Kwajalein and Inawak, which were in the Marshall Islands. Not only that, but Japan itself was feeling the strain of America's naval campaign using submarines to slowly but surely strangle the island nation of its lack of resources. In order to get anything, they had to import it. Hence why they, in 1941-42, decided to attack into the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia. So they were feeling the effects of that, but they were certainly in no way, shape, or form interested in surrendering. And as any book, any documentary, any account, any veteran of the Pacific would tell you, the Japanese seldom surrendered. Matter of fact, it was just something that they didn't believe in. And even though they were facing a slow and gradual annihilation, they kept true to that belief to never surrender. Call it what you want, but that mindset by itself was why, at that time, one could very well argue that the Japanese were in a much better position than Nazi Germany. And then, on top of all that, Italy, who was the third member of the Axis, had overthrown their leader, Benito Mussolini, had jailed him. He was ultimately sprung from jail and set up a new government that was now allied with the Allies. So at the beginning of the war, there were three principal Axis powers. And of course, there were ancillary powers, Bulgaria, Romania, and in no way do I want to minimize their contributions from the standpoint of a historical narrative. However, the three principal Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, in 1944, there was only Germany and Japan. And both of them were being pushed back on all fronts. And now, here in June of 1944, there was a new front that was open that the Germans had to contend with. And that was in Normandy, which is in northern France. And it's, well, in a sort of central location with respect to where it was that the landings occurred, because there was a lot of back and forth over where to go about and actually land the troops, the amphibious assault, that is. Where to land the troops on what beachhead, or where was the best, I guess, port of debarkation. There was talk of Pas-de-Calais, and actually Patton, who was in trouble at this time for slapping incidents and comments that he had made in Sicily and England. He had been placed in charge of a phony army to confuse the Germans and to take their attention away from where the primary marshalling areas were for Operation Overlord. And they, up until the day of the invasion of France, were still under the impression that Patton was going to be the main thrust whenever it would come. There was a discussion to be had about possibly another channel port, whether it be Boulogne or Dunkirk. But ultimately, it was Normandy. that was decided upon. And given the Allied armies that were employed and the subsequent campaign that followed, it was ultimately a good choice in hindsight. Because as D-Day itself went off, though there were some issues initially with respect to, and greatly so on the American side, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, they had been blown off course, or they were confused as to where it was the landing beach was, and they actually landed farther away than they were supposed to, which one could argue was actually a good thing because they did not have to run into the hellfire that their fellow Americans faced on Omaha. And that was a bloodbath from beginning to end. The troops were pinned down. They weren't able to move inland as successfully, and they were, for lack of a better word, like fish in a barrel. And the accounts of those survivors, it reads honestly like the script of a horror movie. Extremely tragic. But such are the casualties of war, and such casualties were not in vain, because though those problems existed, as well as the scattered and haphazard airborne drops, the operation, for anyone who was watching it, was a success. And though Eisenhower, that is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the overall commander of the operation, though he penned a note describing his feelings and how he would ultimately bear responsibility in the event of a colossal failure, and he had on his mind, no doubt, the 1915 invasion of Gallipoli, which was an amphibious operation during World War I, which was a total disaster, as well as the commando raids that occurred at Dieppe, also a disaster. So he had to be considerate and cognizant of those when he penned the note taking full responsibility. Thankfully, he never had to submit it because the operation was successful. Yet, the ultimate plan to break out from Normandy was less than satisfactory. Normandy countryside has a series of hedgerows, and hedgerows, for lack of a better word, are tall trees and shrubs and roots all rolled into one that makes it impossible to see on the other side. So just imagine you're walking and you're walking alongside this big, tall shrub, anywhere from 6 to 12 feet tall. You're walking along and you try to peer over and see what's on the other side, and you're not able to. It's impossible. It was that terrain that the Germans were able to skillfully defend and set up interlocking independent zones of fire, because each hedgerow was like a box. Think of it like a chessboard. And in order to get from one to the other, you had to cross directly through them. And because it was so difficult to cut through, they had to use dynamite, grenades, artillery. There was at one point a creation using metal that was pulled from the beaches, from the tank defenses. They look kind of like an X. And they were put on the front of tanks. And they were successful in driving into the hedgerow, ripping up the roots, and then clearing a path. But however which way the Allies got through one hedgerow, that one opening, generally speaking, was the only one that they could create. And when the Germans were set up in their defensive position, they occupied a field of fire that covered the entire hedgerow. So when one area opened up, which is clearly where the Allies were going to punch through, well, it was that one location that the Germans had to focus all of their fire on. And the casualty rates obviously soared as a result. And at one point, General Omar Bradley, who was in charge of the American ground forces in Normandy, he had a concern, a rather acute concern, that the fighting in Normandy was going to degenerate into World War I trench warfare. And that was certainly the last thing that anybody wanted, even the Germans for that matter, because though it would serve them well initially, eventually they would be overwhelmed by Allied aircraft, artillery, naval gunfire, even. So they, no doubt, would have preferred, though, to keep the Allies in place in Normandy. They certainly didn't want to have too many of their troops bogged down in one sector. So that concern was extremely valid. And that's why he came up with this idea, an operation called Cobra, to punch through the Normandy countryside and actually break out and advance through Europe, through France, and on their way to Germany. That operation, which took place in July of 1944, did enable the breakout to occur, along with British operations that were occurring around Caen, which, if you're looking at the Normandy front from the perspective of an Allied intelligence officer looking at a map, the British were to the left side of the map, and the Americans were to the right. And I will add that the British had British, Canadian, Polish, they had Commonwealth and other contributing Allied forces within their army. To just say British does not do them justice. But it's easy to denote British meaning all of those nationalities. So they were able to find a way to break through the German stalemate, the German imposed stalemate, I should say. And once they did break through, that is when Eisenhower's two most famous commanders, Field Marshal Montgomery and General George S. Patton, were able to break through and dash across France, much like how the Germans had dashed across France in 1940. Specifically, Montgomery was able to drive north and advance along the Channel coast, knocking out or besieging the cities that were there. And actually, there was one city that had a particular resonance with Britain, and that was Dunkirk, which was where the evacuation occurred in 1940 of the British Expeditionary Force, Operation Dynamo. And that port city was occupied by Germans and would actually remain occupied until the end of the war. Kind of an interesting fact in the overall scheme of not only this episode, but World War II in general. These facts that sort of seem larger than life and in some ways not even real. So Montgomery drove north and with the goal of getting to Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. Patton drove south and then east, capturing Orleans and Avranches and a slew of other towns and cities, while also making an impact on Germany's combat efficiency, killing and capturing the enemy in scores, while moving at such a fast rate that not only could the German retreat not keep up, but the Allied logistics and supplies were not able to keep up with him. And that was just his personality. That was his nature. He was an old cavalryman, so it was go, go, go all the time. On top of that, in August of 1944, August 15th, Operation Dragoon occurred, and that was a landing on the southern coast of France, and it was a Franco-American force that would drive north and would occupy an area on the front that was south of Patton and would ultimately border along the French-German border all the way to Switzerland. So by mid-August, and that's also when Paris was liberated, the Allies were on the march, and they would not be denied what they believed was the ultimate victory. And they had timetables that said, well, we're not going to reach the Rhine until May of 1945. But keep in mind, the River Rhine was the main natural barrier that separated Germany from France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, etc. And they thought they were only going to get there, if they're lucky, by May 1945. But when the breakout occurred, those timetables were thrown right out the window. And that's when they got giddy about the possibility that maybe this war could end by the end of the year. Maybe we could have the boys home for Christmas. How many times has that been said in military history that's ultimately been proven wrong, or was just a complete falsehood? But they had that idea. They had that vision that danced in their head. But the vision did not correspond with reality. And the reality was Montgomery and Patton were driving hard and fast against the Germans, who I would add, to their credit, did conduct a very skillful rearguard defensive retreat. Though they were mauled by Patton, and Montgomery certainly had his fair share of successes, the Germans were able to get a majority of their forces intact back to the Rhine and sort of be in a position to either launch offensive attacks against the advancing Americans or dig in and have a war of attrition akin to Normandy. But obviously now they were fighting with their backs to their country. So they had some success with respect to not being completely obliterated, much like in June of 1944, as D-Day occurred, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, and that operation virtually decimated Army Group Center and removed it as a fighting force and an entity for the entirety of World War II. Obviously, the units were patched up and they had other Army groups and battle groups that were paired off and created from it. But the defeat and destruction was such that they would never again be able to fully recover. Had that happened in the West, it certainly would have been a tragedy. But the Germans were lucky in that regard. One of the few things that they were able to say they caught a break on. And another one was logistics. Bradley is often, I guess you could say, quoted, or he is credited as saying, amateurs worry about strategy. Professionals worry about logistics. And just to give a broad idea as to what the logistical situation looked like by, say, September 1944, the Allies had pushed so far and so fast east and north that they began to outrun their supply lines, or their supply lines were becoming so stretched to the max that they were afraid they could easily break. And that's because the supplies had to be trucked from Normandy all the way to wherever the front was. If that was Montgomery, that was up by Belgium. If it was Patton, in the Saar, Lorraine, which is the region that borders Germany, in France. And while there were additional ports in Allied hands, Cherbourg was captured in June of 1944, for example, or Marseille in the south, which is where Operation Dragoon began, and the Allies were able to move north from. They were either destroyed in the case of Cherbourg, or they were so far out of the way that they were utterly useless for the main Allied thrusts that were now occurring. Case of Marseille. Thus, the Allies had to come up with an ingenious way to get the supplies necessary from the beachhead all the way to the frontline units. And again, just one statistic that stands out that's mind-boggling to think of. On average, each day, the Allied advance consumed roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline. Almost half was consumed by Patton's Third Army alone. So to get those supplies trucked from the beachhead up to the front was not easy. One of the actually ingenious creations was the Red Ball Express, which was a unit primarily of African American soldiers who drove trucks day and night, 24/7, to get the supplies to where they needed to go. And they were successful for a while. And at some point, something had to give. The straw that broke the camel's back would eventually arise somewhere, whether it was in Montgomery being told to stop or Patton being told to stop, because Eisenhower's plan of a broad front approach, while ideal when looking at a map, may not have been tactically sound, even maybe strategically sufficient, given the situation. And it was in this context that Montgomery decided to pitch his idea for a quick operation, strike into the Netherlands to end the war, and bring the boys home for Christmas that year. And he had offered up the idea because at the time his forces had captured the strategic Belgian port of Antwerp, and it was intact. Germans didn't destroy it, or they at least didn't have time to destroy it. But while that's all well and good, the port isn't on the Atlantic. It's not like Le Havre or Dunkirk. It's 40 miles inland. And in that 40 miles, one has to travel up an estuary, the River Scheldt, to get to the port, and then conversely to get out back to the Atlantic. So the Germans, the German 15th Army that is, and again, it's interesting to note that they had a whole army intact, may not have been up to the proper regulation and requisite strength, but they still had an army intact, which, given the progress the Allies made, pretty remarkable, and certainly would not have been the case had the Soviets been conducting this operation. That's just to get back to my earlier point. The 15th Army was one of those units, and the 15th Army occupied the stretch of land on both sides of the River Scheldt, and they mined it, they dug defenses, they fortified it, and basically told the Allies, if you want Antwerp so bad, you're going to have to get through us. Otherwise, you're going to have to keep on trucking from Normandy. So while Bradley, Patton, and Montgomery saw the situation for what it was, and Montgomery ultimately sent his Canadian forces to clear out Scheldt and the banks on either side of it. Eisenhower decided to halt the broad front approach and signaled his support, or at least a willingness to entertain, the idea that Montgomery had devised, which was Operation Market Garden. And in the first book that was reviewed, The Battle of Arnhem by Antony Beevor, the author gives a very concise and also a very broad overview of what exactly that operation entailed. And as I had mentioned, it was very ambitious, it was high stakes, it was a roll of the dice. That if it came up big, then the Allies would be successful and could possibly end the war by Christmas. This was, of course, the thinking. The latter months of fighting that occurred in 1945, which were some of the most deadly when it comes to statistics on casualties and deaths and overall ferocity. Their idea was that possibly this terrible war could be ended here and now with this surgical strike into Holland. And as Antony Beevor writes, this was, quote, the new operation, which would be called Market Garden, consisted of two parts. Market was the airborne operation, in which the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions would seize river and canal crossings from Eindhoven to Nijmegen, with the big bridges over the rivers Maas and Waal, the largest in Europe, while, further on, the British 1st Airborne Division and the Polish Brigade would drop near Arnhem to capture the great road bridge over the Neder Rijn. Browning, that is the operations commander, Major General Frederick Browning, was pleased with his phrase describing Market as an airborne carpet, as if it simply had to be unrolled in front of the ground troops. Operation Garden would consist principally of Horrocks, that is Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, 30 Corps, led by tanks, charging north up a single road, with polder land flooded plain on either side, broken only by woods and plantations. They would keep going all the way over the bridges secured by the paratroopers. After crossing the bridge at Arnhem, they would occupy the Luftwaffe air base of Deelen. The 52nd Air Landing Division would be flown in, and from there, 30 Corps would carry on all the way to the shore of the IJsselmeer, a total distance of more than 150 kilometers from the start line. The objective for the British Second Army was to cut off the German 15th Army and the whole of the Western Netherlands, outflank the Siegfried Line, be across the Rhine and in a position to encircle the Ruhr from the north, or even charge on towards Berlin. End quote. Again, just from that little section, there were so many moving parts, so much sophistication that was going on. It was almost like a finely tuned watch in which every single piece of that watch had to be synchronized with every other piece. I mean, as it says, the airborne troops would land, capture the bridges. Now, those bridges were to be then crossed over by the armored unit. If the paratroopers didn't secure the bridge, the armored unit couldn't get across. If the armored unit could not reach the airborne forces in time, they would ultimately be overrun, and thus the bridges would again relapse back into the enemy's hands. And the forces that were utilized for this operation had experience in combat, particularly the 82nd Airborne Division, which had fought in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy before they were coming into this, which in the case of some soldiers was their fourth parachute jump. The 101st which had introduced itself to World War II during Normandy, Operation Neptune, which was the airborne component of Operation Overlord. They themselves were experts in the art of war, and they were a fine-tuned killing machine that the Allies had been itching to utilize and to deploy against their foes. And the British 1st Airborne Division had seen action in North Africa. The Poles, them being from the Polish Brigade, were also itching for a fight. Around this time, there was an uprising that was occurring in Warsaw. The partisans and the resistance movement there were looking to overthrow the German occupiers. And they were itching to either drop in to Warsaw and assist their fellow countrymen, or find the nearest Nazi they could and kill them by any means possible, but making sure that the killing that took place was as long and as painful as possible. Keep in mind, they had been under the Nazi jackboot for almost 5 years, and no people suffered more than the Poles. The statistics show that the Soviets did, but in terms of duration, and then ultimately the numerous powers that occupied it, because don't forget, the Soviets had also invaded in 1939 and occupied the half of the country that was designated to them, the eastern half. So they were certainly looking for payback, whether it was a Nazi or a communist, really anyone who was against the idea that Poland should have its independence. And then, of course, 30 Corps was attached to the Second Army, which was advancing steadily through France and up along the Channel coast. And they had been part of the unit that liberated Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium, in early September. So these units were certainly skilled and well trained and were not novices to combat. This wasn't Operation Husky, when the 82nd Airborne had never conducted a parachute drop, or this wasn't Operation Torch, when no Allied unit had ever conducted an amphibious operation of such magnitude in Europe. By now, the tactics and strategies that were to be utilized were refined, and the commanders knew exactly what it was that they were doing, at least from a planning standpoint. And one of the important things with respect to planning was having logistics and intelligence set up. With the former, the 35,000 airborne troops were to be shuttled across the channel by around 1,500 C-47 Dakota transport planes, which were the workhorse for transportation and logistics for the Allies during World War II, and around 500 gliders. The Horsa and Waco gliders were the ones that were utilized by both the British and the Americans, and in this case as well, the Poles. But the issue was they did not have enough to land all 35,000 airborne troops in one shot. In the case of the British, there had to be 3 separate, though not consecutive, airborne drops in order to get all of the men into Arnhem. And that will be important later on. Additionally, the latter element that was crucial was that of intelligence. Intelligence had reported that the Germans who were in the Netherlands were mostly old men and children. And while any frontline combat infantryman will tell you the evidence of whether or not the intelligence was true or frankly worth a damn was at the sharp end of his bayonet or the business end of his rifle, there was general optimism that this intelligence was indeed correct. And they believe that the forces that were in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the area where the operation was going to take place, were second rate. They were not expecting any crack Wehrmacht, which was the German army units, or those of the SS, who were even more ferocious and more feared than the regular German army units. And with the intelligence also came this notion of traveling up this single road. Anyone who's ever been in combat will tell you, you never leave the same way you came in. In this case, there really wasn't much of a choice. The British tanks had only one road, one solid road that could withstand the weight and the consistency in which all the vehicles, few thousand, would be pushed up that road. But being on a single road raises a lot of interesting questions or dilemmas. If you're traveling up, and let's say you're in a 10-mile convoy, if the enemy were to ambush you or counterattack and split the convoy in half, well, the head would be cut off from its rear base of supply, and then piecemeal could be destroyed. Or conversely, let's say it's a 1-mile convoy, Germans ambush it, they knock out the front and the rear, and then they concentrate on everything in between. And anyone would tell you that that usually isn't a good recipe for success. And that goes back thousands of years. The famous Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca, he was able to level a defeat against the Romans by doing just that. He attacked the front and he attacked the rear. I believe at Lake Trezemi in northern Italy. Came in down through the fog and practically annihilated the legionnaires that were there. So this goes back to the time of the Romans, the attacking the front and the rear if there's only one path accessible. And the fact that that was merely brushed aside as well, 30 Corps will be able to do the 60 to 65 miles in only 2 to 3 days. Because keep in mind, paratroopers are lightly supplied. Though they carry lethal firepower, they don't have the same caliber of weapons and the same overwhelmingness of fire as a regular infantry division, artillery, tanks, etc. They have just what they have to jump with. Not only that, but they also have limited supplies, water, food. It's not like they were riding high on the scale of being fully loaded and having enough supplies to last them. They had enough to last a few days, because the point of an airborne unit is to drop in, take a position, hold it, and then relieve within a reasonable amount of time. Now, obviously, because the paratroopers were skilled and you could argue special forces units, they would hold out until relieved, irregardless of whether or not they were beginning to feel the pinch. It only became a crucial situation when their casualties mounted, their ammunition ran dry, their food was consumed, their water drank, and their medical supplies all used up. And that again will also be an important factor in this story. So the notion that 30 Corps would be able to punch through and get to where they need to be in 3 days, even with the intelligence assessment itself, still did not give enough room to the possibility of a bridge being blown up. Or not only a bridge being blown up, but the necessary tools and equipment that would be brought up to replace the bridge that had been destroyed also being destroyed. It'd be a dark humor moment if a bridge was blown up and then the replacement bridge was also blown up. So there's really no room to enable that possible scenario to enter the minds of those who were planning the operation. And again, that all comes back to the intelligence, which is, well, if we're facing old men and kids, they're not going to have tigers and panthers and all these sophisticated weapons like 88s, and they're not going to know how to use MG42s, or if they do, it's not to the level of sophisticated crack units. And it was that assessment that they were able to plan the largest airborne operation in all of military history in about 7 to 10 days. And it's crazy to think that more paratroopers were used in this operation than D-Day, but D-Day was planned over many months, and one could very well argue was planned over years. Nevertheless, everyone from the generals on down was feeling relatively confident at the great new, possibly war-ending operation that they were about to embark on. And on September 17th, 1944, around 2:15 local time, the C-47s, which had some of them were attached to Horsa and Waco gliders, switched on their engines. The exhausts began to putter. Black smoke mixed in with some purple and red was seen from the engines, and the roar of the propellers began to deafen anybody who was within earshot. That was then followed by lines and lines of paratroopers with all of their gear, their weapons, anything essential that they could carry, lining up to board their planes or hop into their gliders in sticks. And a stick is a general measurement that is utilized for determining how many troops were in one single aircraft, generally 18 to 20. And the same is true with a glider. Gliders could also carry other assortment equipment, and that'll be discussed here in the next passage from Antony Beevor. This is him discussing the gliders and how when they lifted off, they were attached to their accompanying C-47s, and they had no locomotion themselves. They were entirely at the mercy of nature, the wind, the rain, and obviously there was little that they could do with respect to enemy fire from the ground, whether that be anti-aircraft or whether it be machine guns, and then also fighter pursuits from the Germans. As mentioned, one of the goals of Market Garden was to capture that airbase at Dealing. There was no doubt a possibility, a real possibility, that the German Luftwaffe units that were stationed there would rise up into the sky, intercept not only the transports but the gliders, and shoot them to pieces. And that was because the airborne operation was occurring in daytime. It was the first major combat airborne drop that occurred during the day. Husky and Neptune were both at night. Now, there was an operation in the Pacific, but that was relatively small in terms of the scale compared to Market Garden. So as Beevor notes, quote, "A glider's chance of survival was slim if hit by anything larger than a machine gun. Not far from the landing zone, the crew of a Sterling tug plane felt a sudden jolt. Flak had taken off the tail of the Horsa they were towing. Then a wing sheared off and the tow rope broke. They heard later from the pilot of a neighboring aircraft that he had seen bodies falling out as the glider disintegrated. One glider pilot recorded their approach over the nadir rain." This is quoting the pilot. Quote, "We're almost at the release point now, and the scene below looked exactly as it had appeared on the photographs at briefings the previous day. To starboard, I could see the main reason for our trip, the bridge across the Rhine," end quote, Beevor continues, there was chaos ahead as scores of gliders tried to land at the same time on the heathland northwest of Wolfhez. There was no air traffic control, so the co-pilot, if they had one, kept looking in all directions, watching for other gliders while the pilot focused on landing. The other problem was cows. Sergeant Roy Hatch became desperate when a cow kept running ahead madly rather than escaping to the side. Even once the glider came to a rest, the men were still not safe. There was always a chance of another glider, out of control, crashing into it. Since it was safer in the open and doors were often jammed, soldiers slashed or smashed their way out of the side of the fuselage. End quote. Just imagine, for a moment, you're a young, say 19, 20-year-old, you're in a glider, and you feel the jolt of the rope being released. And you can feel the descent, slowly at first, but then it begins to pick up some speed. It's almost like being on a roller coaster. But unlike a roller coaster, it's not attached to anything. Roller coaster is usually on a rail. Moreover, roller coaster tends to have an endpoint, unless there's a mechanical error. There was no such luxury afforded to gliders and those within, pilots, troops, or otherwise. So they were, as I'd mentioned, at the mercy of really every single possible element that impacts an average combat soldier's experience. Murphy's Law can perfectly be applied to gliders. And there were, as Beevor notes, there were numerous instances of gliders crashing, wings sheared off, barreling into the ground, hitting a stone fence or hitting a wall or hitting the side of a house. And the casualty rates, though not as substantial as Husky and Neptune, were certainly pretty alarming for that first day. And again, gliders could carry more than just troops. They could carry jeeps, they could carry artillery, they could carry ammunition and medical boxes. So it wasn't just men who were in harm's way, but also the supplies that were necessary to keep those men fighting for the 3 days in which they were supposed to. But of course, they had more than enough, at least in their mind, to supply them for possibly 4, 5, or 6 days. But other than that, and of course this is a minimalization of how the initial market portion of the operation went, because of course there was German flak, there was a lot of chaos with planes shot down, and certainly for gliders it was more deadly than just jumping out of an airplane. After all, they're made of wood that a single spark could turn the entire thing into a tinderbox. On the whole, the operation on the first day for the market component seemed to be going very well. In the 101st Airborne Section, they were able to make a drive on Vagel, which was one of their objectives, and the bridge there. They were also able to get to Eindhoven, which was a major city that was along the road that 30 Corps would be traveling up. In the 82nd area, they were able to land within a few hundred yards of the bridge at Grave and immediately seize it. At Arnhem, even though they landed 8 miles away, which was by design, if you can believe it, they were still making forward progress towards the bridge at Arnhem, and there was already units that were on the move. So it appeared initially, and again, this is certainly an oversimplification, but it appeared initially that the first contact with the enemy on behalf of the Allies, and the paratroopers in specific, was going rather well. And they had a lot to sort of ponder and consider and digest in their own minds to say, well, this could have been a lot worse. And it certainly could have been a repeat of Husky, where the Allies had a friendly fire incident, or Neptune, where the sticks of paratroopers were dropped all over the continent and Cherbourg Peninsula and the Normandy countryside. But because it was in the day, the units were able to get to their designated dropping zones and landing zones, form up into units, and effectively go about capturing their objectives. On the garden front, the first day went a little bit different. And actually, if anything, it served as sort of a grim foreshadowing of what was to come, trying to travel up that single highway that the planners brushed off as well. It's not that big of a deal. We've done worse, was certainly a notion that they carried. And that was because just prior to jump off, there was an increase in activity of German troops massing along the Belgian-Netherlands border. And that border area became honeycombed with German troops, artillery, mortars, any available means in which to prevent the surging forward of the British armored units. And Beevor has a great passage about this in which he describes that first initial encounter that 30 Corps had with the Germans along the Belgian-Dutch border. And he is able to utilize different perspectives and different firsthand accounts that weave together a narrative of just what it was like to be with the armored forces as they kicked off their portion of the operation around 2:45 local time. And he writes, quote, "For the first few minutes, everything seemed to go well, but as they passed the border post into the Netherlands, one tank after another was hit. Soon, 9 were blazing. Vandeleur, that is Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vandeleur, commanding the Irish Guards, called in the RAF." Now, this is Beevor quoting Vandeleur. "It was, quote, it was the first time I had ever seen typhoons in action," he recorded later. "And Jesus, I was amazed at the guts of those pilots. They came in one at a time, head to tail, and flew right through our own barrage." End quote. End quote. Beevor continues, quote, "Just behind Vandeleur's scout car came 2 RAF vehicles with the forward air controllers, Squadron Leader Max Sutherland and Flight Lieutenant Donald Love." End quote. Beevor continues, quote, "Love found to his dismay that some of the Typhoon pilots did not have the right gridded maps. So when Squadron Leader Sutherland gave them their targets, they could do little. Instead, they had to use the tanks burning up as a landmark to show the positions of forward troops." End quote. Beevor continues, quote, "Lieutenant John Quinham, who had abandoned his blazing Sherman, was standing by a man who was shot through the heart by a sniper." This is Beevor quoting Quinham. Quote, "As he fell, he very clearly said, 'Oh God,'" Quinham reminisced later. "I've often thought it a nice theological speculation whether he spoke before or after death." End quote. End quote. Beevor continues, quote, "Accompanying infantry from the 3rd Battalion brought back prisoners. The guardsmen were very rough with snipers, whom they forced to trot down the road at the double, while prodding them with bayonets. One prisoner, perhaps out of panic, tried to break away and run." This is Quinham again, quote, "Frankly, he was dead the second the thought entered his mind. Everyone seemed to take a shot at him. He only got about 15 to 20 yards before he was shot to pieces." End quote. End quote. Beevor continues, quote, "Vandeleur had ordered a bulldozer tank to take position close to the head of the column. This was fortunate since it was badly needed to clear the road of the 9 shot-up tanks before those coming up behind could continue. After the nasty shock of the ambush destroying so many of their tanks, Vanderleer was concerned at what else lay ahead. End quote. So you see there, it's the opening for Garden was not all that it was hyped to be at headquarters. And it wasn't that the 30 Corps armored column was being led by an inexperienced commander or somebody who had outdated methods of fighting. Quite the contrary. Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vanderleer was experienced. He would go on to be a recipient of 2 Distinguished Service Order medals, which are no joke in the British Army. And for him to be the spearhead of the spearhead spoke a lot to his acumen as a leader, tactical brilliance as a commander, and trust that his superiors had in him. And even for him to have on this first day a concern of, well, this really isn't looking like it was planned out to be, certainly sent chills down his spine, and no doubt down the spine of his fellow tankers and his fellow infantrymen who were advancing alongside with 30 Corps. And though it was just the beginning, as I had said, it was certainly a foreshadowing of what was to come, because this one single road would be the scene of 10-mile traffic jams, German ambushes and counterattacks that would knock out a tank or a truck or even just an infantry squad and completely paralyze the entire advance. And the advance was predicated on, again, like that fine-tuned watch, each part being synchronized with every other part in order to work successfully. And if any one part was unsynchronized or out of whack, then the watch itself wouldn't work and it would be useless. Thus, the entire operation itself would be a failure. If the plan that was in place was not successfully executed. And from the beginning on the Garden front, it seemed like possibly, well, maybe there was a strong chance that things were not going to go on as well as they had planned or hoped or what have you. But for what it's worth, the paratroopers were still having their fair share of successes and failures. There was tough fighting around Zon, which was in the 101st section, in which one of the bridges that they needed to secure was destroyed. So right then and there's another issue that arose, a fly in the ointment, as the saying goes, that was not considered when planning out the 2 to 3 day advance. In the 82nd area, Nijmegen was under heavy bombardment and fire and fighting between the Germans and the 82nd Airborne paratroopers, and had yet to be secured. And in Arnhem, though the bridge was secured on the north end of the road, it was only held thinly by one battalion, and that battalion was Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion. What's interesting about Frost is he was a rather interesting historical figure. He took part in the radar parachute drop Operation Biting back in 1942 to secure German radar equipment, secrets, infrastructure, in any way to disrupt the German war effort. But now he found himself in control of the 2nd Battalion, and along with him was C Company of 3rd Battalion, Royal Engineers, Royal Ordnance Corps, Signal Corps, and Ordnance Corps was the heavy artillery and mortar and all those types of firepower supplies and rounds and necessary, well, let's call them bullets for cannons. Signal Corps, which was your communications squad, usually they would lay down wire that would connect via field telephones, one unit to the other. Major Freddie Goff's reconnaissance squadron of Jeeps, which had the initial goal of racing to the bridge, holding it, ideally both ends, and then the follow-up infantry would arrive because, again, there was that 8-mile gap. So to get there quick, fast, and in a hurry, Freddie Goff's Jeep squadron was Johnny on the spot. And they were the ones that were needed to be there first and foremost before the follow-up infantry arrived. Otherwise, the possibility that the Germans would control both ends of the bridge or even below the bridge itself was strong. So they had about 700 men that were on the north end of the bridge. And they got there towards the end of the 17th, and they tried to make a sally to find out exactly what was going on the other side of the bridge, and then obviously around in the town, city rather, that they had now become the liberator of, temporarily at this point. Ultimately, 30 Corps would be the final say of the liberator. They were, and the best way to use it, they were sort of like frontier folk in the American West, the paratroopers. Germans, Native Americans, bandits, whomever. And 30 Corps was the cavalry when they needed to be there to help and prevent the slaughter of civilians. They had to get there on the double. They had to hoof it. And there was little that the paratroopers could do other than seize their immediate objective and hold until relieved. So the liberation of Arnhem was, by this point, premature. And though the British and Allies had gotten a toehold in the city, it was not enough to consider the entirety of its inhabitants free from German occupation. The next day, September 18th, Monday, the Germans decided to find out exactly what was going on the north end of the bridge. All day yesterday, they had seen the airborne troops fly in, drop out of their airplanes, or detach from their gliders. They had seen some go down. They had seen the fires from some of the gliders. And they figured, well, they must be landing to secure the bridges, because what else is there of importance here? So they decided to have a makeshift unit to go and reconnoiter the British position. And Antony Beevor is able to relate exactly what that motley crew of German forces looked like, had the aspiration to, and ultimately the result of their reconnaissance mission. Quote, a signaler up in the attic shouted, "Armored cars coming across the bridge." That was quoting the signaler. Frost experienced an irrational surge of hope that this might be the vanguard of 30 Corps arriving ahead of time, but he was swiftly disabused. He and his men watched in fascination as the column had to slowly weave its way through the burnt-out trucks on the northern ramp. The paratroopers expected the leading vehicles to blow up on the necklace of anti-tank mines they had laid across the bridge, but the first four Pumas, 8-wheeled armored cars that were used for reconnaissance, firing their 50mm guns and machine guns, accelerated away past them into the town. Determined to make up for their slow start, Frost's paratroopers finally reacted with every rifle, Bren, and Sten gun available. The mortar platoon and the Vickers machine guns also opened up with devastating effect. The anti-tank gunners from the light regiment found their range, and the next 7 vehicles were hit and set ablaze. Grabner's, that is Sturmbannführer, roughly equivalent to a major, Victor Grabner's, men, having never experienced a battle in such a confined space, tried to escape, but the vehicles crashed into each other. a half-track back into the one behind, and they became locked. The open half-tracks proved to be death traps. Their ambushers were able to fire down and lob grenades into both the driver and Panzer Grenadier compartments. One tried to escape down the side bank of the ramp and smashed into a school building. Another crashed through a barrier and fell to the Riverside Road, which ran under the bridge. Some of those trapped on the bridge jumped from the parapet into the Nader lane. Grabner himself is said to have been killed when he climbed out of his captured Humber armored car to try to sort out the chaos. The smell of roasted flesh permeated the air for hours afterwards, mixed with the stench of the oily black smoke from the blazing vehicles. Grabner's body was never identified among all the other carbonized corpses. End quote. Let's first just take in that scene for a moment. We'll go back to the example of the 18 or 19-year-old glider occupant. You survive the landing, you use your rifle to bash your way out and get to freedom. You now find yourself fighting against Germans in Holland over a bridge, and those Germans happen to have not tanks, at least not yet, but tank equivalents, half-tracks, armored cars, vehicles with artillery guns on them. And all you have, or the best you can muster, is a Piat anti-tank gun, which is a British equivalent to a bazooka. But mostly you had the Lee Enfield bolt-action rifle, the Sten submachine gun, which was notorious for just being a completely terrible weapon, and the Bren light machine gun, and some Vickers as well. But again, only sparingly did you have the firepower requisite to go up against even a semi-armored force. They held their own. They were able to keep their foothold on the bridge intact. But it was the first wake-up call for the British that something was not going well in Arnhem. This, and of course, the communication breakdown, which would be notorious for the entirety of Operation Market Garden. But the fact of the matter is that the paratroopers were not up against old men and kids. Far from it. They were up against the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, who were withdrawn after fierce fighting in Normandy to be recuperated, rest, and refitted in Arnhem. It was only by chance that they were there when Operation Market Garden occurred. Now, I would like to point out, and I mentioned earlier, that to say that a division was there, a bit of a stretch. All German units at this time were not up to the full strength and had the full complement necessary for a division, be it armored, infantry, etc. And they actually had a unit that was on its way to Germany to be refitted and get replacements just to rest. But the fact that they were there, and they were there in a sizable force, and they had those weapons that could easily overwhelm the British, who were, well, doing everything they can to hold on to the bridgehead that they now had on the Rhine. It was disconcerting for a British paratrooper to say, look, or at least internally to say, look, we don't have the right equipment to go up against the Germans, at least now with what the situation was. And not only that, but they now had the problem of being cut off. Not just the British who were on the bridge, but the British throughout the entire Arnhem area. And that was because they were landed so far away, and because the objective was so obvious to the Germans, they were able to marshal their resources. They were able to get battle groups and combat units together, albeit it was sort of a motley group. They had veteran SS soldiers, they had green Luftwaffe anti-aircraft gunners, they had some Kriegsmarine sailors who had nothing better to do. There was some military police and even German infantrymen, all cobbled together and put into these units that were ultimately going to strike the British where they were and destroy them piecemeal because they weren't all concentrated. It goes back to what was said before, which is if you're going to be attacked, it's best to be consolidated and to have all your forces together and to be able to be mobile. The British were neither. They primarily had walking as their only source of locomotion, and they were spread out. Now, to be fair, a majority of them ended up around Oosterbeek, which was a town just north of the Rhine River. They were able to set up a defensive pocket there, but they were not all concentrated on their objective, which was the Rhine River, or the bridge at Arnhem. As a result, the force that was there had, well, only to see the writing on the wall, which was unless 30 Corps could get to us soon, and unless we're able to be relieved before the Germans really start to muster in their strength, we're going to be overrun. And that's exactly what occurred with the Germans who were in Arnhem. They got their tanks, they got their infantry, they brought their artillery, and they systematically went to work wiping out the British bridgehead in Arnhem. And slowly but surely, they were able to fight, and they fought well for 3 to 4 days. But it all comes back to the fact that they, and I had mentioned before, this was going to be important, they were running out of ammunition, had little to no medical supplies, food and water levels were low, the casualties were continuing to rise. So Frost, really having no other choice, had to give up, had to surrender, because any further fighting, any further conflict was going to be detrimental to his men. And it was pointless because their objective was to seize the bridge, which they seized the north half of, hold it until 30 Corps arrived, which they did not do, and then be withdrawn, which by that time they would be probably at the sweet spot of their maximum combat effectiveness. Because again, they only have a certain amount of supplies, a certain amount of ammunition, a certain amount of manpower. Ultimately, they had to surrender. And it was difficult and bittersweet because all those losses that occurred fighting for the bridge seemed to be in vain. And what was even worse was that the Germans seemed to have been getting supplied by the Allies because the Allies had supply drops, and they had them in certain areas, mostly clustered around Oosterbeek, which is where General Roy Urquhart, who was the commander of the British 1st Airborne Division, had centered his headquarters and the remainder of his paratroopers. They kept falling out of range and landed in the hands of the enemy. So when the British were captured on the bridge, it was, well, shocking, to say the least, to see that their enemy had their supplies and they had them in abundance. And it really made them sort of realize that they themselves were not the only ones in a bad state of affairs. And indeed, that was more than accurate. As the fighting progressed, 30 Corps did indeed march up that single road. They fixed the bridge at Zon. They zoomed across Grave. They had some fighting in Nijmegen, but ultimately were able to come out successful. Yet, by the time Sunday, September 24th rolled around, it was clear that there was really no feasible way to continue the operation as planned. And as a matter of fact, the high command or the commanders of the operation decided, well, maybe it's time that we cut our losses. We reassess, see what went right, what went wrong, and try to do better next time. But they still had men on the other side of the Rhine. Thus, they came up with a plan to get men across to try and reinforce and then set up the conditions for an evacuation. Because the fighting that was occurring around Oosterbeek, the Germans were on three sides, the river was on one. And if the Germans got on all four sides, they were going to annihilate the British paratroopers. And already they had severe casualties up to this point. But that plan is, as Antony Beevor notes, as follows. Quote, after nightfall, Sunday, September 24th, the Dorsets and the Polish Parachute Brigade prepared for the crossing of the Rhine River. As the night wore on, Tilly's, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Tilly's, anger grew. The rations they had been promised failed to arrive, and there was still no sign of the boats at 2200, 10 o'clock, when Major General Beevor Thomas had insisted the operation would begin. Like most of Operation Market Garden, almost everything went wrong, usually due to incompetence compounded by bad luck. Part of the convoy, which was supposed to head for Driel with rubber dinghies, failed to take a turn to the left and drove straight up the Nijmegen-Arnhem road and through the front line. The Germans let the convoy carry on into the town of Elst, where the trucks were surrounded by Naust's Oberleutnant der Panzer SS Commander, which is just a fancy way of saying equivalent to a lieutenant, Panzer Grenadiers, to the astonishment of the Royal Army Service Corps drivers. In the end, only 9 boats arrived. The Dorsets did not receive the boats until 100 hours on the Monday morning. As for the rest of the Polish Parachute Brigade, they had 3 rubber dinghies, which could carry 2 soldiers each, and 3 6-passenger rubber boats. Frequently, flares lit up the crossing area, ran the entry in the brigade war diary. A lumber yard was also burning on the north bank, perhaps set alight deliberately by the Germans to provide illumination for their machine guns, which were otherwise firing on fixed lines. The flames were reflected on the water as the Dorsets paddled hard, using rifle butts and entrenching tools in their fight against the strong current. The Poles even used their hands, as they too lacked paddles. End quote. Beevor continues with, quote, in his impatience, Colonel Tilly had insisted on taking the first boat. Tilly and his boatload had started to climb part of the Westerbauing heights when they bumped into some German reservists, who might have been happy to surrender. In the chaotic encounter, Colonel Tilly was hit in the head by a stick grenade, which fortunately did not explode, but as more Germans arrived, he had to destroy his copy of the evacuation plan before surrendering. B Company, under Major White, was hard hit, both during the crossing and on arrival. The Dorsets had set out with 18 officers and 298 men. Only 5 and fewer than 100 men would return. Sosobowski's, that is Major General Stanislaw Sosobowski, the commander of the Polish Parachute Brigade, his warning to General Thomas's about the dangers on the Heverdrup-Westerbauing route had been sadly vindicated. At 02:15, after only 75 minutes, Brigadier Ben Walton called a halt because enemy fire was so intense. The other two Polish battalions further to the east managed to land no more than 153 men unwounded on the north bank. End quote. I'd said earlier that along with the British, there was the independent Polish parachute brigade, and they were itching for a fight. They wanted to get vengeance against the Germans for what they had done and what they were currently doing. And they were led by this guy, Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, who was a very intelligent, competent, and you could say psychic commander, because he had predicted. He said, look, if you try to get these troops across this area where they were to try and relieve the British and get them across the river, it's not going to end well. You're going to have a lot of casualties. People are going to die. But because the British were rescuing their own countrymen, and as Beevor even notes, incompetence combined with bad luck, they brushed him off. No, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea. You've only been fighting for a few days. And that is true. They had to land days afterwards, the Poles, because of weather and because of the aforementioned equipment issues, C-47s and so forth. So they were just dismissed outright. But as this entry notes, they took a shellacking there along the riverbank. They were ultimately unable to fight against the Germans in any meaningful or successful way, and were pretty much used as cannon fodder and eventually scapegoats, because both Browning and Horrocks later on would pretty much throw the blame at the feet of Sosabowski, who was very low on the ladder. He was a low rung, that is, and he was low on the totem pole as well. So to throw the blame at him really is a disservice to this idea of the Allied powers, and then also the forces in which you have on your side that are willing to give their life when they would much rather prefer to be in Warsaw fighting with their countrymen. That was a bone of contention for Sosabowski's paratroopers, and something that, as the uprising was finally crushed on October 1st, 1944, they felt bitter that the Allies would not allow them to go and fight. And there were a lot of reasons behind the scenes, particularly with Stalin not allowing it, but suffice to say, they didn't understand fully at the time. So they were bitter. And throw in on top of that a resentment against the British for being blamed for their own failure, for a plan that didn't work. You can imagine what that did to the cohesion and morale of the Allies. And certainly, if that didn't ruin it, the end result for Operation Market Garden certainly did. The bridge at Arnhem fell. Of the 10,000 plus or minus troops that went into Arnhem, less than 2 came out. There was more than 8,000 casualties, killed, wounded, mostly captured. And the plan that had been in place did not ultimately come to fruition. It was a disaster. It was a high-risk gamble that failed. But that area alone was really the only strategic failure. And even Montgomery admitted, as much as he is pompous and arrogant and what have you, he mentioned that he felt the operation was 90% successful. And the reason for that is because in the other two sectors, held by the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, they were able to successfully secure their objectives, hold them until relieved, and ensure that the line of march for 30 Corps remained open. And this certainly isn't to discredit the British. Absolutely not. They fought tooth and nail, hanging on by their fingernails, with dwindling supplies, ammunition, but rising casualties. And their feat is won in courage strength, determination, and defiance against all odds. But the fact of the matter is that the 90% that Montgomery credits as successful was not the British, was not his fellow countrymen. It was the Americans. And one of those American units was the 101st Airborne Division. And this then leads into the second book, that being Hell's Highway by George Koskimaki, the title of which was a nickname that the road to Arnhem was called by not only the 101st, but was adopted by any and all units that had to fight and see their friends die in Holland. Between the attacks, the ambushes, fires, death all around, it was rightly named. And the author himself was actually there. Koskimaki was a technical sergeant, a radio operator. And what he was able to do in his book was get exclusively first-hand accounts, eyewitness reports from his fellow paratroopers. And he was able to put them together and weave them into a narrative, a very tremendous narrative. And this doesn't take away from Beevor's book at all. Beevor is a premier historian. He's no doubt one of the best. Certainly that is a contemporary historian and will probably go down as one of the best in history. But Koskimaki isn't looking at this from a historical or historian's point of view. He's looking at it from an eyewitness on the ground as it happened perspective. And he's able to do so, I think, in a very effective way, and he's able to get the feelings and capture the emotions from the words that were being communicated to him by his fellow Screaming Eagles. And again, the 101st Airborne Division, they had the objectives of Vegel and Zonn, the bridges they had to secure, as well as the major city of Eindhoven. And Eindhoven was to the 101st Airborne Division what Nijmegen was to the 82nd Airborne Division, to what Arnhem was to the British 1st Airborne Division. So it was a very substantial city. But their main objectives were Vegel and Zonn. So when they took off on September 17th, 1944, they were locked in and they were focused on that objective. And they had a proud history thus far. They had dropped into Normandy. They led the way there. They were able to knock out the guns that were attacking the amphibious landing forces on Utah, and they secured the critical crossroads town of Carentan on D-Day plus 12. That enabled the assault troops on the beachheads of Omaha and Utah to link up and continue to push inland. So they were no amateurs to combat, not by any sense. But like anything else, once you get the firing started, and once the enemy starts to shoot at you in anger, it doesn't matter how experienced you are, you're still going to feel scared or frightened or fearful or happy or all the other emotions that one can think of being in that position. I know that if I was among this group and even if I had seen combat, the anticipation of waiting to be able to jump, or ultimately feeling the exhilaration of being shot at and the danger, the instinct of fear, of fight or flight, that would have easily come out of me. I don't think that there's any debate there, and it's interesting to think how others today would be able to cope with it. But this is Koskimaki, his first passage that I found very impactful and very relevant was of a young trooper who experienced and discussed his experience jumping out of the airplane. And this was Corporal Peter Santini. He was attached to the Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. Now, Parachute Infantry Regiment is about the size of a brigade. I know that that was mentioned in Beevor's book, and it's about anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 men, plus or minus. I mean, again, this is sort of the general arithmetic, and the digits obviously are not always exact. However, the thing that is exact is that when you first come into contact with bullets that are flying past you and whizzing above your head, even if you've been in combat for years, it's still a frightful experience. And as Santini relates, as Koskimaki wrote in his book, quote, some flak burst beneath the plane and she lurched quite a bit. Captain Roy Martin, voiced roll back to us above the din and roar of the motors, telling us that we were about 30 seconds from the drop zone. About that time, some 20mm shells whizzed right by his face. Luckily, he wasn't hit. It was time for the jump now. The men in the other planes began to bail out. We still didn't have a green light or a verbal go signal. We waited for a few seconds, which seemed an eternity, then jumped without even getting the green light. All the men in our plane landed right on the field. It was a good thing Captain Martin jumped us when he did, because if he had waited a few seconds longer, the end of the stick would have landed in the woods. The Air Corps did a wonderful job on the drop. A repetition of the Normandy jump would have proven very costly. We saw wave after wave of planes coming right behind us. They were all in formation. They even slowed down while the men were bailing out. End quote. So obviously, he being a veteran of the Normandy jump, knowing what that was like, knowing how chaotic it was, to be able to give a vote of confidence to the pilots who had a reputation for being timid, especially during Husky and Neptune, says a lot. And it also says a lot how he was able to very calmly talk about flak bursts in a shell, 20mm shell, which could put a hole the size of a baseball through somebody, were whizzing through the plane where the men were prepared to jump. And I think it speaks to just the nature of that generation, the greatest generation, that they're able to calmly talk about what they were involved in or what they did or anything, but be very humble about it. You could easily talk about this in a very dramatic sense, describing the color of the flak burst, if it was purple or red, or the thick sort of contrast that the black smoke had against the clear blue sky, or the hole that was made in the frame of the plane, and how the wind was sucking through the plane as the 20mm shell shot through. But there wasn't really any of that, at least in this particular accounting. And it was sort of like he was describing something very basic in any old, sort of run-of-the-mill story, minus the fact that this occurred during wartime, and as he was being actively shot at, with the enemy intending to kill him and his fellow paratroopers. And then he also goes on to relate, what I mentioned before, which was the drop itself was relatively clean, I guess is the best way to describe it. Unlike being scattered all over the place or the planes being shot out of the sky, the paratroopers were able to fall in an orderly fashion, assemble in their drop zones, and then begin to go on the march and secure their objectives, and to go about capturing the necessary bridges that were extremely essential for success in Operation Market Garden. And as I had said, the Vogel was secured relatively easy, straightforward, and there wasn't any issues. And again, this is an oversimplification, but compared to, say, Zon, it certainly went a lot smoother. And that was because Zon was destroyed. And there's a passage here from a Sergeant Hugh Pritchard, Dog Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And he was there, present, when the bridge exploded. And he recounts sort of what that was like, how he felt. And as a non-commissioned officer, he had responsibilities that exceeded those of a regular, say, corporal or private, which was he was responsible for the lives of men. And they looked up to him. They saw him as a leader. And he had to communicate confidence, calm, and clear direction. And to be cool under fire. But he recalls the destruction of the Zon Bridge as follows, quote, "Out in front of everybody was Sergeant Alan L. Westfall, leading the entire regiment. We were moving swiftly through the main street of Zon. I was on the sidewalk on the left, taking a little cover, while Westfall was in the middle of the street at double time and yelling," quoting Westfall, "Come on, you guys," and quote, "Suddenly, a burst of machine gun fire raked the street with one slug getting Westfall through the calf of the leg. He quickly crawled over to me and said, quote, 'You know, that was stupid of me, wasn't it?' End quote. We were about 200 feet from the bridge when the Germans blew it up. We jumped back under the cover of the buildings while huge chunks of wood and other debris rained down all around us. I had no idea I was that close to the bridge, and I am sure that if Westfall had not been shot, creating a temporary delay, we, he, I, and others, would have been on that bridge when it went up." End quote. So this Sergeant Hugh Pritchard, he had a lot going on in just the span of what seemed like only 5 minutes. They were advancing through this town, and it was probably eerily reminiscent of the fighting in Normandy at Carentan, which itself was an urban center. They were advancing. His buddy, Westfall, was out in front, got shot, got wounded, made a joke to him about, "Oh, that wasn't too bad." I mean, that wasn't. And then as they were advancing, the bridge blew up. So in the span of however long that was, they had to deal with urban combat, they had to deal with casualties, and then they had to deal with the first catastrophe of the operation, the first, you could say, bad luck that befell the Allies. And that was the destruction of the Zon Bridge. And that bridge, when it went up, it was no doubt a punch in the stomach to the Screaming Eagles. They had hoped to secure all their objectives, no matter the cost, no matter the time it took, but in so doing, secure them fully and completely. And Zon was not necessarily as swift and as efficient as they wanted it to be. Clearly. Otherwise, they would have secured it and it wouldn't have been an issue. So this, occurring on September 18th, 1944, ultimately was the first disaster of the operation. And the quick decision by Pritchard to jump back, or even the decision not to act and to go and help his buddy Westfall, saved his life, but at the expense of witnessing an impediment, 230 Corps, which again was on that tight schedule. And they had a really, really, really difficult advance ahead of them, even before an issue like this arose. Yet, Zon was, and again, sort of an oversimplification, Zon was really the only big disaster that the 101st Airborne Division had to deal with. Obviously, all the casualties that occurred are disasters. Anyone who's ever been in combat will tell you it doesn't matter about the objective, it doesn't matter what the commanders want. It matters that you get everybody home and that your buddies are safe and that you're okay. So the deaths, they are the biggest tragedy of any military engagement or any war. But from a strategic standpoint, the destruction at Zon was really the only major problem that occurred for the 101st Airborne Division. And that was because they were able to relatively easily secure their other objectives. One of those being Eindhoven, which was a city that was before Zon, in which had to be secured in order for it to enable 30 Corps to continue to advance, because it was on Hell's Highway. One of those who was fighting in Eindhoven, again, an urban combat situation, was a radio man, Corporal Joe Hoganmiller, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And he recalls the combat to Koskimaki as follows, quote, "As the radio operator, I moved down the street, keeping the company commander posted on movements of 2nd Platoon. As the 1st Squad got in position, Sergeant George Martin saw a German soldier walking south on Kloosterdreff, shot at him but missed. Lieutenant Russell Hall, Technical Sergeant Hugh Borden, and Sergeant John Taylor moved through a space between two of the buildings on Klooster, saw a Dutch woman waving at them out of a window, pointed down the street at several German soldiers walking toward the gun emplacement. Hall, Taylor, and Borden jumped into the street 10 yards behind them. Taylor yelled, 'Halt!' and the others yelled, 'Stop!' The Germans halted, offering no resistance, and were taken prisoner. In another area, Sergeant Charles Johnson jumped up, rolled over a brick fence, surprised 3 Germans moving to an 88 gun position, and took them prisoners. Other Germans disabled that second gun. Due to the fast movements of the 2nd Platoon of F Company, the German 88 gun positions were wiped out. A large number of prisoners were taken by F Company. 41 and 13 Germans were killed. The 2nd Platoon suffered only 2 casualties." End quote. So as you see, it's a success all around. Germans killed, Germans captured, few casualties, a town liberated, and a people overjoyed. And I do want to hit on 2 points here. One is that the Dutch population, much like the Poles, had been subjected to brutal repression and occupation since 1940, and they were a neutral country. They did not want to get into the war. They had no intention of being involved. Much like in World War I, they wanted to stay out of it. They wanted to keep their hands clean of the bloodletting. But Nazis ultimately overran them in short order and instituted an occupational government that, up until then, and especially after this operation, was extremely brutal. So to see their liberators in the flesh and to see the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack, it made them take pride in the fact that maybe their long national nightmare and their individual struggles were over. Furthermore, they were also able to assist the Allies. There were certain resistance members and underground units that in some cases actually took up arms with the paratroopers, not as just guides or scouts or interpreters, but they fully got into paratrooper uniforms, helmets, ammunition, canteens, etc., and they got into the fight, and they got into it in a substantial way because they were fighting ultimately to liberate their country. So they had absolutely no hesitation in doing what needed to be done, whereas maybe some sensibilities among the Americans weren't as shallow. The Dutch certainly were all in, and they were willing to do whatever was necessary to liberate their country and to get freedom back that they once had. And then additionally, there was the mention of the 88s, and the 88s were German anti-aircraft initially, and then artillery pieces, and they were some of the most, and probably the most ferocious artillery anti-aircraft gun of the entire war. They were effective. They would scare the wits out of anyone who faced them, and they were deadly. They were able to shoot down a plane as well as they could shoot a tank, and there was very little that they couldn't shoot through, no matter the armor. And even the 88s were installed on some tanks, specifically the Tiger tank, which in and of itself was a scary sight for anyone who came about its presence, even if they were in the close confines and relative shelter we shall say, of a tank. So those guns being knocked out were crucial, because if they were still in place, they would be able to delay 30 Corps' advance, which is already going to be delayed to get to Zon, to then put the bridge up. But there was a real possibility that the 88s would destroy the bridge that was going to be utilized, the Bailey Bridge, that is, and thereby further delay, further prevent 30 Corps from getting to Nijmegen and Arnhem, and throwing the operation into jeopardy. However, as Corporal Hogan Miller noted, that wasn't the case. And even the day before, on the first day of the operation, the 101st Airborne was able to notch one of the first successes of the entire operation, and that was the capture of the bridge at Wegel. And Wegel was before Zon and before Eindhoven, and it was the first major bridge that needed to be secured in the three areas in which the Allies had designated for the operation. The capture of that bridge was told by Private First Class Carl Cartilage, Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. And he was actually part of a unit, or the group, that landed and was close enough to be gathered together to then seize the bridge, and to do so with relatively minimal loss to life, which was big, and then also little resistance, which they had expected from the intelligence reports. But even still, any infantryman is very weary of what is said to them by a commanding officer or a superior, as PFC Carl Cartilage noted to Koskimaki by saying, quote, Colonel Howard Johnson talked to the 3 regimental intelligence teams just before we took off for the Holland invasion. Each team had a bridge to task as quickly as possible. After the landing, ours was the rail bridge at Wegel, and if we got it, then down the road on the other side of the road bridge over the Wilhelmus Vaart Canal. And he told us how important the bridges were and how quickly we must move out and seize them before they could be blown. He wanted the bridges by 1300, and he, I suppose to inspire us, said that the first man over any of the bridges would be awarded a silver star, but not to stop at the bridges. The battalions were right behind us, and to keep moving forward, even though the town of Wegel, if all went well. We took off for the bridges, but Frank, Chief Sawyers, was nowhere to be seen. We left without him, Becker, Teachman, Thorne, Brown, and myself. We followed the railroad tracks at a trot and waved the Dutch people back into their homes as they ran out to greet us. They were all in their Sunday church clothes. For those minutes, it just didn't seem like a war to them, and perhaps even to us. We took the bridge in 29 minutes. As we were crossing the bridge, there was Chief Sayers, bandaging a German he had shot through the shoulder. Thorne shot a German motorcycle rider as he crossed the bridge. The fool had stopped and jumped off his cycle with his machine gun and was going to win the battle of the bridge by himself. I suppose Thorne was the first across, but Chief held the bridge early before we got there. Brown got 3 more Germans as we crossed the bridge onto the road. Chief got the first bridge of the Holland mission and the first German, but no one got a silver star. End quote. You'll note that his biting, witty sarcasm of the colonel, who said, "Oh, I'll give you a silver star if you can capture," obviously didn't happen. It was just an inspiration. Whether or not he called him on it, who knows? And it was unlikely. Infantrymen cared little about pieces of tin or metals. It wasn't important to them. What was important was to make sure that their buddies, 1, weren't killed, 2, they weren't killed, and 3, they didn't let their buddies down. Because that, to them, was, in many cases, worse than death. But this was a Pyrrhic victory, though there was the intense feeling of being in combat, and obviously Cartilage's unit in the intelligence section knew its job. It was Pyrrhic because the bridge at Zahn was eventually blown up. So even though Vagel was secured and they were able to defend it for 30 Corps to get across, ultimately the victory was not as grand as it could otherwise have been. Nevertheless, the 101st Airborne Division was able to dig in and secure their area. They were able to fight off numerous counterattacks that came their way. One particularly brutal one occurred around Vagel, and the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles held the line along Hell's Highway, not only to allow 30 Corps to continue to advance, but also to make sure that the line remained open to get supplies and whatever else was necessary to the 1st Airborne in Arnhem, who were trying to evacuate and had the unfortunate, I guess, stigma of not being able to successfully follow in the footsteps of their fellow paratroopers and capture their objective, or at least to be able to capture and hold it. So the 101st Airborne was able to do that extremely successfully. And they were quite willing to do more than just that. Though Market Garden was over by September 25th, the fighting that occurred around Holland did not cease. As a matter of fact, the participation by the 101st Airborne in operations tangential to Market Garden, but not in themselves a full-fledged component of the plan for Market Garden, continued. One of those was a daring rescue of some 150 Allied paratroopers and airmen who were shot down, dubbed Operation Pegasus. And this occurred between October 22nd and October 23rd. So again, outside of the parameters for Operation Market Garden, that is true, but it still was related to the operation itself because a majority of those men who were looking to escape were formerly airborne paratroopers who were now stuck behind enemy lines. Because at this time, obviously, the British had to give up in Arnhem. They had to surrender. They did what they could to evacuate, and there was only about 2,000 less that were able to fully evacuate when Major General Roy Urquhart got across the Rhine. But there were still men that were hiding and that were waiting for salvation to just try to maybe get back to their unit, fight the enemy another day, and at least survive. And that operation was remembered by a Sergeant Donald Malarkey, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which for those of you listening who heard that unit designation, that is in fact the Easy Company. He was Band of Brothers. And this was his recount to Koskimaki of Operation Pegasus. Quote, following the preliminary discussion, a somewhat disheveled, red-bearded British colonel was brought into the room and introduced. It was explained that he had worked his way through German lines and swam the Rhine the night before into the division sector. He related that he had been working with and aided by the Dutch underground. They had a plan to effect the escape of as many as 140 Allied soldiers, mostly British paratroopers, from German territory west of Arnhem. He laid out a detailed and elaborate plan that was to culminate in a river crossing through the 2nd Platoon sector a week later. Doby, that is Lieutenant Colonel David Doby, stated that all the paratroopers, airmen, escapees, etc., were secreted in various Dutch homes, barns, buildings, some as 15 miles away from the projected crossing point. They would move each night toward the Rhine, led primarily by Dutch women. The line of direction was to be identified by the firing each night at midnight of 10 rounds from a British 40mm gun from atop the dike, across the orchard into the high ground west of Arnhem. The British assault boats would be placed in the orchard ditch the night before the crossing, which would occur at 0100 hours. The following night, signaled by a red flashing light. 2 men from the 2nd platoon with rifles and Tommy guns would ride in each boat in the event German positions were encountered. Driving back to the company area, I remarked to Lieutenant Frederick Heiliger, that the plan seemed almost too perfect to have a chance. He said the British were exceptionally resourceful when they were cornered. The next week would determine the validity of that statement. End quote. Indeed, they were resourceful when they were up against the wall, as Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain showed, and then they were also resourceful when their countrymen were in trouble. I mean, after all, think about it. If you had fellow countrymen that needed your help, and you were in a position to give the help, wouldn't you want to help them? Or if the roles were reversed, and you were in desperate need of help, and your countrymen had the opportunity to come and rescue you, wouldn't you help them? Wouldn't you go out of your way? I know I certainly would. And that's what Dobie had planned here. And with the assistance of the 101st Airborne Division, this daring, successful nighttime plan was able to evacuate 138 men from under the noses of the Germans, who would have otherwise been captured, some possibly executed, depending upon whose hands they fell into. And they were then put back into circulation to get back at the Germans and then fight another day. And that was the big thing. The big thing was that the troops were now back in the Allied camp. Yet, the 101st would remain in Holland, in the dikes and orchards, and dikes are man-made irrigation systems, because Holland is known to have, it's famous for their orchards and flowers and their dikes. They stayed there in the mud, in the rain, in the cold for almost more than 2.5 months. From September, when they began Operation Market Garden, well into November, and some even early December. And in that time, specifically Operation Market Garden, they sustained 50% casualties. And this was after the division had fought in Normandy and had sustained severe casualties there. So they were just rolling from one operation to the other with high casualty rates. And for lack of a better word, it was appalling to many that this unit, this proud and combat-ready unit, was utilized in such a fashion where it was decimated time and again. And many of the soldiers even argued, they said, look, we're strike and hold. We're supposed to be dropped in to where the enemy is located, to where the objective is, capture the position, hold it, and then relieve. We can't be utilized in a fashion that's equivalent to a standard infantry company. And that's nothing to knock against a regular line infantry company. Every frontline combat soldier earns their respect by just being there, because they are part of the roughly 20% who actually see the enemy, who shoot at them and are shot back in anger, whereas a majority of those who serve, about 80%, are behind the lines. And that's not to knock them either. But again, to have this sort of differentiation between the line infantry companies and the paratroopers, from the standpoint of engaging in combat and facing the enemy, the only real difference is the fact that one volunteered and one received more substantial training. Other than that, they were pretty much on par. I mean, as the name indicates, parachute infantry regiment. Yet, their utilization was, in the eyes of some, very mismanaged, and a lot of people thought it was Montgomery meddling to keep the airborne divisions under his control for as long as possible. And some would argue that that was the case, because that's just how Montgomery was. And that is certainly a topic for another day. And then finally, the last book, The Battle of the Bridges, focuses on a singular parachute infantry regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Now, of the three airborne divisions that had participated in the fighting during Operation Market Garden, it could be argued that the 82nd was the most experienced of the three. And it could further be argued that that is because the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which this book by Frank van Lunteren is about that unit and how that unit participated in this particular case in its 15th mission. They had fought in Sicily, they had fought in Italy, Anzio, and in Normandy. They had gained a reputation as a group of hard and determined fighters, and indeed, they were all American. And I do want to note one thing about the notion all American. This book was actually written by an author who has a personal connection to Market Garden from the civilian Dutch perspective. As you can imagine, the name Van Lunteren is not very Anglo. And even if it was somebody who lived in the United States whose family immigrated, nevertheless, it is interesting how he was able to write about this parachute infantry regiment and how they contributed to the liberation of his nation, of his people, and ultimately his family. So I just want to note that before, I guess, there's any more further detail. And he begins by talking about how the Parachute Infantry Regiment, while it didn't participate in Operation Neptune, there was a unit that was used as pathfinders, but the regiment itself was in reserve after having fought in Sicily and Italy. They had gotten replacements, and much like the 101st Airborne, replacements were not only a dime a dozen, but they were sort of treated in a way that was standoffish. Nothing personal. Not at all did the veterans hate the replacements. They just didn't want to get too close to them because they saw time and again what happened. A new guy, a replacement, as they said in Vietnam and FNG, they would find themselves in combat. They wouldn't know what to do. They were so inexperienced that one thing led to the other. They would get killed. And the veterans hated to see replacements get killed because if they knew them, it would only make things worse. So Frank van Lunteren relates a story of a new replacement who arrived to the 504th. It was the I Company of the 3rd Battalion, 504th, and was sort of getting his bearings as to who do I talk to, what do I do, what do I not do, can you give me some advice? And surprisingly, they were actually communicative to him. Sometimes they would have just brushed him off or, like I said, didn't want to talk to him. But in this case, he was actually able to obtain a good insight as to what to prepare for and how best to get in the right mindset for the upcoming operation. And Lunteren writes, quote, Hughes, that is Para First Class Walter Hughes, learned that he had been assigned to Captain T. Moffat Burris's I Company. This is quoting Hughes now. I had arrived in England without a weapon, so Sergeant George Davis told me to take one from supply. I asked Lieutenant Robert Blankenship, what weapon should I take? Anything you can, he replied. So I chose a Thompson submachine gun. End quote. New in the outfit, knowing that another combat mission could be far ahead, Hughes was anxious to find out how to survive in a battle. He presented this question to Private William E. Ed Ha, a veteran of several campaigns. This is quoting Ha now. Stick to Captain Burris, Ha replied. He's bulletproof. Another thing Hughes soon learned was that it took a long time for anyone to remember his name. The veterans were just not interested. Experience had taught them that most replacements were hit in their first battle. He could well be no exception to this unwritten rule. Because of his accent and youthful appearance, they dubbed him the Kid from Brooklyn, a name that would stick for quite a while. End quote. So you see, it was sort of a harsh reality for the replacement, just trying to find their way, figure out what they were doing, come to grips with reality that was now going to be their life, and then sort of being dejected, discarded, not even given a chance by the veterans. And that was because the veterans knew what to expect. They experienced it, they saw it before, and they didn't want to repeat because their nerves were already getting to a point where it could easily break. The last thing that they needed was to have a replacement whom they tried to give advice to get killed and have that be on their conscience. And this was, again, one story that could easily be applied to the many from the replacements who found themselves in the 101st, 82nd, and British 1st Airborne. They had to figure out where they fit, how they fit, and the best way in which to fit. And the only way that they were going to know fully the best way that they were going to fit in the puzzle piece of their unit was when the bullets started flying, when they entered combat. And that occurred, as mentioned, on September 17th, 1944. And much like how the 101st Airborne had dropped with some flak and some sporadic enemy resistance, the 82nd, which had been with the 1st Airborne along the northern route for the operation, also experienced some close encounters, shall we say. Again, nothing to the degree of Normandy or Sicily for those who were still around, but certainly to an extent that made them a little jittery. And as Van Lunteren notes, the effect that the German fire had on them certainly was nerve-wracking, but also expected, especially these veterans who had been in combat previously. And he writes, quote, "The Protestant chaplain, Captain Delbert A. Kuhl, accompanied Captain Moffat Burris and his stick to Holland. One of the paratroopers took 2 pictures of their stick before takeoff. For some of the men on the photo, like PFC Walter J. Muzinski, it would be their last." This is quoting Kuhl. "As our plane crossed the channel into Holland," Kuhl recalled, "we saw the Germans had flooded great areas, evidently to avoid our seaborne invasion. We soon saw many built-up areas with anti-aircraft gun emplacements. Soon they were firing furiously at us. We saw a stream of tracers coming right at us, as if it were going to swallow them. Moffat and I were standing at the door. The instinct to survive made us both jump away from the door and behind the paper-thin aluminum fuselage, which afforded us no more protection than the open door. The volley raked the back of the fuselage to the tail. Moffat and I looked at each other and began to laugh." End quote. End quote. Talking about landing on a fire and a bit of morbid humor. You know, they were just in the doorway. They were getting ready to jump. They had seen below that the Germans had copied their tactic from Normandy, which was to flood the field so that when the paratroopers landed, they were weighed down by their equipment and would drown, which did happen in Normandy. And then they also saw the flak, machine gun fire, and all the other accompanying weapons that tried to shoot them out of the sky. And they knew right then and there that they had to jump, and experience taught them the fuselage wasn't going to protect them at all. It wasn't worth a damn. And it's just funny how, in reading this account, he notes that he looked at Moffat, clearly a veteran like himself, and they both laughed, sort of getting a gallows humor out of this airborne assault, and how they were able to sort of be at ease with themselves into what they were getting into, which a lot of veterans were. It was sort of the mindset of, we just want to get this on and over with and get back home. A lot of the replacements were, I want to get into combat, I want to shoot, but obviously the veterans were disabused of that notion, and so would the replacements if they survived. As mentioned, the 82nd Airborne was able to swiftly capture the Grave Bridge. They were able to do so on September 17th, 1944. One of those who was present that was able to make the quick advance to capture the bridge was First Lieutenant John S. Thompson, E Company, 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He relates from the time in which he got onto the ground in Holland up until the capture of the bridge, the chaos that ensued, but the first major success in the entire Operation Market Garden plan. And he recalled, as Van Lunteren writes, quote, I could see up ahead the little walled town of Grave, with the majestic bridge just 1,000 yards to the north of town. We were separated when we landed, which worked out well. There was considerable enemy fire now coming from the vicinity of the bridge and along the road. 4 of my men landed in the canals, which were quite deep. 1 man went in all the way, and the weight of his gear kept him under for a while. He was waterlogged when we pulled him out and was in no condition to assist us for a while. This left us with 17 men, 2 wet walkie-talkies, and plenty of firepower, including 2 bazooka teams, which turned out to be a very decisive factor in our attack on the bridge. We were very close to the bridge, and to wait any time at all would destroy our surprise factor. We could tell that there was mass confusion around the bridge, of which we took advantage. We moved quickly toward the bridge as enemy fire from the left side of the bank, particularly from the flak tower, continually kept going over our heads. We felt quite naked out there, especially with the enemy on high ground. But we had good cover in spots because the canals had steep banks and depressions. We were now moving as fast as we could up the steep bank to the road and the approach to the bridge. 1 squad on the left was already there, and 3 of my men were chasing 3 enemy and a motorcycle across the bridge to the north. Everything was happening very quickly. The enemy were in turmoil, and we certainly had the advantage. Some were taking off across the fields toward Grave. Others disappeared over the other side of the road and down the bank, where many foxholes were located. 2 men were sent to inspect the bridge spans to look for possible demolition setups and, if possible, work their way to the north approach to the bridge. All of a sudden, down the road from the vicinity of Grave came a command car loaded with personnel, followed by 2 truckloads of troops. 1 bazooka team on the left was to pick off the command car, and the bazooka team on the right was to get the first truck. It was indeed fortunate that we landed so close to the bridge. End quote. Moffat Burris, Captain Moffat T. Burris, he is known as a very skilled commander and a very able leader. And the title of T. Moffat Burris's book, Strike and Hold, can easily be applied to what First Lieutenant John Thompson went through. They landed quickly, they assembled with what they had, they got their firepower together, they then went after the bridge, they tried to secure both ends, they checked to make sure it wasn't rigged with any explosives, they moved hard and fast in their fire and maneuver, and ultimately they drove the Germans off, they repelled any counterattack, and they held the bridge for as long as necessary until 30 Corps arrived. And again, this occurred on the first day and was considered the first major success of the operation because of the fact that it was such a large bridge and because it was of such strategic importance given its location and proximity to Arnhem. It was the first bridge the 82nd Airborne had to secure amongst its objectives. Yet, the arrival of 30 Corps was delayed due to the destruction of Zon, and their continued advance was further delayed because of the fact that the bridge at Nijmegen, which was really crucial and was actually already primed to explode by the Germans, was still in their hands and it wasn't fully secured. So 3 days after Market Garden began on September 20th, as 30 Corps finally rumbled into Nijmegen, clearly behind schedule, a plan was devised to go and seize the bridge. And the best way to seize a bridge, any military tactician or amateur strategist would tell you, is both ends at once, thereby ensuring that the enemy isn't on one end to remain and possibly blow it up, because the demolition charges, generally speaking, were via a wire, which would almost always mean that they would be close by, though not always the case. So the plan was to send a battalion across the river and have them assault the northern bank of the river where the bridge was, advance, capture that end, and then have the tanks of 30 Corps advance through the town, through the city rather, secure the southern end of the bridge, link up, and continue on to Arnhem. Because after they secured the bridge at Nijmegen, 30 Corps was less than 10 kilometers away from Arnhem. And this was the third day. So, yeah, the British were sort of, hanging on, and they had the necessary rations and ammunition, running low, no doubt, but it still could be successful. There could be a victory salvaged here and now. And the person that the hopes of the operation now rested upon was Major Julian Cook, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And he was handpicked by General James Gavin, the lieutenant general who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division. I think at this time he might have been the commander who was present, matter of fact, because he was one of those commanders that was always going to be present in the field of battle, and he didn't want to necessarily be back behind the lines. And he was actually the guy who led the assault into Sicily, and this was his unit, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He led them in the assault in Sicily, and he was now leading the entire division in Holland. So Gavin, who was actually a major general at the time, he handpicked Cook, and he said, "This is your mission, and not to put any pressure on you, but the entire operation now rests upon your discretion, your direction, and your determination as a leader," which was a lot to throw on a late 20, early 30-year-old. But nevertheless, Cook took the bull by the horns, and as he is related as saying by Frank Van Lunteren, he, quote, "I plan to be like Washington crossing the Delaware, a la painting. But with men being knocked off and feeling the lead around me, I soon grabbed an oar. Being a Catholic, I began to pray, 'Hail Mary,' one stroke, 'full of grace,' stroke, second stroke. But since 'the Lord is with thee' is too long, I kept repeating, 'Hail Mary,' one stroke, 'full of grace,' on the next stroke." My S3, Captain Henry B. Keep, tried to remember his days at Princeton and his boating experience. So he was going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. He remembered counting 76, 77, 78, 79. I also remember the little machine gunner, Private Jedlicka, from H Company, 3rd Battalion. As our boats got close to the other shore, everyone began to jump overboard, as the flanking fire from the Nijmegen Bridge was intense. I was just getting ready to get out of my boat when I saw a bubble of air come up out of the water. I hesitated a moment and saw a bulge in the water moving to shore. My sensation was one of confusion of the disturbed water. It was the machine gunner, a little fellow who, seeing the others leave the boat, took his 2 boxes of ammunition, one in each hand, and simply jumped into the water and started walking, even though down, but he walked out with them. Later, he told me he knew that we needed the ammunition. End quote. So you see, Gavin's leadership style of leading from the front clearly trickled down as Cook was right there with his men, rowing, praying, making sure that the bullets would pass by him harmlessly, and ensuring that when they got up onto the shore of the embankment of the river, all of his men who were alive were accounted for, and then they pressed on to attack. And they were able to successfully secure the northern end of the bridge, and they, for a moment, thought themselves in a vice, and the Germans were preparing to destroy the bridge, which they did have the ambition to. Ultimately, that didn't happen, much to the relief of the Allies, who at that point, if the Nijmegen Bridge had been destroyed, then the operation, no doubt, without question, even though it was only on September 20th, would have been a failure. And not only that, and this was also something that Cook had sort of a bone to pick with the British, was that once they got across, and once his infantry secured the bridge, and then they secured this castle that was to the west of the bridge, the tanks just stopped. And Cook looked at the tank commander and was like, what's going on? What's the matter with you guys? I would like to point out that Vandeleur was no longer the spearhead. His unit had taken such heavy losses that they had to be replaced by a newer and fresher unit. So obviously here, this wasn't Vandeleur. Nevertheless, he was talking to the commander and he was saying, look, I got across here. We did everything we could. I lost half of my guys. And you're going to stop here and you're going to twiddle your thumbs? And the response was, well, we got to wait for our infantry. They're following up. They're important to support us. And to an extent, that is true with armored warfare. You need the infantry in order to flush out enemy who are in trees, who are in buildings, who are there, So the tanks themselves can't just roll on forward, unless it's only a tank-to-tank battle. And the Americans, by that point, as well as the British, knew full well that you needed infantry to accompany armored vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, etc. So Cook's frustration was one of emotion. But if you were in his shoes, how would you have reacted? You just got across the river. There was machine guns. There was mortars. There were snipers. You led your men up the embankment. You got to the bridge. You secured it. You almost got blown up. And then you see your compatriots who you were just with celebrating this bridge being captured, doing nothing. The whole point of the operation is to get to the 1st Airborne Division. And that's the other thing, too, is you're watching fellow countrymen just sit and do nothing. How would that make you feel? I don't know if your reaction would be any different to that of Major Julian Cook's. After all, there's a lot of emotions at play when fighting, and anger is certainly one of them. And no doubt that was expressed by Cook at this time. And he was proven correct, might not be the best term, but his insistence on getting the tanks rolling, on getting them north, ultimately came to fruition. They were stopped a mile short, and the British 1st Airborne had to ultimately evacuate what meager gains they had. And then from there, they ultimately spelled the failure of Operation Market Garden. But the fighting on the 82nd Front would not end on the 20th of September. It would actually continue. And there was a lot of fighting that occurred to the east in the Reichswald, which was a German state park area that Gavin, when the planning occurred, he emphasized that needed to be of primary importance and that needed to be something that needed to be secured because there were high grounds, there were hills that would ultimately, if they were in the hands of the Germans, pin down 30 Corps before and after they got to Nijmegen, and would ensure that the bridge was always in sight of potential artillery where the Germans could then destroy it. So there was a lot of fighting that occurred there, and the fighting was brutal, it was intense, and that's where a majority of the 82nd Airborne casualties were for the operation. And as Van Lunteren notes, there was one engagement that occurred, no more than a squad combat, in which the fighting was intense, it was brutal, and it was, well, frankly, the sort of stereotype that one thinks of when they think of combat that occurred. Not only in this battle, this operation, but also in World War II in general. Squad war, platoons fighting it out, close in, hand to hand, very personal. And as Van Lunteren notes, the fighting was as follows, quote, Private John R. Toll, a bazooka man in C Company, posthumously won the Congressional Medal of Honor when the enemy counterattacked his company with infantry and tank. Toll left his foxhole, crossing open ground under heavy fire, and beat off tanks with rocket fire. He killed 9 Germans with 1 round and was attacking a half-track when he was killed by a mortar shell. Private Albert E. Winningham, a machine gunner in company headquarters, witnessed the death of Private Tolley. This is him quoting Winningham. My buddy and I had a 30 caliber machine gun in a ditch along the Dyke Road. Private James Killmeyer, Tolley's assistant, came back from the road out ahead of us. He sent him down and tied his hands behind his back to calm him down. He started to eat dirt and almost bit his finger off when I tried to stop him. There were 2 tigers up there, and we would see them once in a while. Tolley calmly came back for his bazooka and knocked them out, one by one. Then he came by and asked, Do you have a cigarette? I gave him one and a light, and when he was about 30 feet away from me, a mortar shell came down close, and a piece struck him in his throat. He was about half on his back when he died. End quote. End quote. You know, it's heroism like this that ultimately got that 90% success rate that Montgomery talked about. And again, I'm not a Montgomery apologist. For him to even be so blinded by his arrogance to say, oh, it was 90% successful without acknowledging the fact that, no, there was clearly a breakdown from start to finish and failure across the board. It is still interesting to note that this was going on even after it was clear that the operation was not going to succeed. And the fact that he was this Private John R. Tolley, and I'm probably butchering his name, so I apologize, was able to calmly go about his duty and, again, go above and beyond to the point where his comrades were saved at the expense of his sacrifice. And it was that sacrifice against overwhelming odds, fighting to save his comrades, win at all cost, which was the mantra of the American paratroopers. But much like their brothers in the 101st Airborne, the 82nd did suffer casualties. They had 1,500, and they were part of the over 4,000 American casualties that were suffered during Operation Market Garden. And though the operation did not fully succeed, it is not to say that these sacrifices were not in vain. After all, if we were to go back to Monty's assessment of it being 90% successful, the Americans did liberate Eindhoven, Wegel, Zon, Grave, and Nijmegen. The Allies also were able to put the German 15th Army in a position where they eventually had to reel back from the Scheldt estuary, and ultimately the Canadians were able to capture it in November, thus opening up the port of Antwerp. Moreover, they were able to extend the line of advance of the Allies, thus further spreading out the German meager defenses up against their own, it was called the Westwall at the time, stretching into the Netherlands. So these sacrifices were certainly not in vain, though a little more planning and possibly better adherence to the intelligence reports, especially from the Dutch underground, who was on the side of the Allies from go and wanted nothing more than to be liberated, could have forestalled the ultimate end result. And as I had mentioned, the occupation of the Netherlands by the Germans was extremely brutal. It would only continue to get worse. The minister, Rijkskommissar, who oversaw the Netherlands, a guy named Seyss Urquhart, who would ultimately stand trial at Nuremberg, he led a campaign of repression and reprisals against the Dutch population for not only helping the Allies during Operation Market Garden, but also afterwards, a la Operation Pegasus, hiding those Allied troops that were behind the lines. And that ultimately culminated in a famine that occurred in the winter of 1944 and 45, which brought untold hardships to the suffering Dutch population. And the Netherlands themselves wouldn't be fully liberated until May of 1945. So for almost 10 months, the Germans continued to remain in the Netherlands. They were able to exert their control and their power, and they were able to continue spreading fear, hate, and death. And yet, one of the more interesting things to note is the citizens of the Netherlands, even today, view us fully as liberators, even after what had occurred in Arnhem. They held no ill will, even though they were systematically, you could say, butchered following the operation. They didn't hold a grudge because they knew that was the reality of war. The Americans and the British were doing all they could to liberate them, and they did liberate some of their countrymen. And to this day, they still tend to the graves of fallen servicemen who died in the Netherlands, which I think a touching tribute to the sacrifices and how they indeed were not made in vain. And perhaps that is the best way to conclude this first episode. Indeed, this was a bridge too far. Until next time.